The first time I understood that water could kill you, I was 7 years old, and my mother was teaching me how to pray for the opposite of what you want. That doesn't sound right when I say it that way. Let me start again. In the village of Kalthi, nestled in a valley between two mountain ridges that seemed to hold the sky closer than anywhere else I've ever been, we didn't fear rain because we are unprepared for it. We weren't primitive people, despite what outsiders sometimes assumed when they heard our story. We had doctors. We had books. We had a medical clinic that Dr. Harris had established in 1987, right in the center of our village square, with white walls and a red cross that faded a little more each year. We had nurses. We had the internet by the early 2000s, at least in the municipal building. We weren't ignorant, but we were trapped in something worse than ignorance. We were trapped in certainty. We knew exactly what rain brought, because it had brought the same thing every monsoon season for 3 generations. And that certainty, once it takes root in a place, is almost impossible to extract. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. My grandmother used to say that the valley itself was breathing. Can you feel it? She'd ask me, and I would stand very still in the early morning, before the heat came, and try to sense the mountain ranges expanding and contracting like the ribs of some enormous sleeping animal. I never felt it, not really, but I loved the idea of it, the idea that we lived inside something alive. Something that had its own rhythms and seasons and moods. The valley's mood, it seemed, was sickly during the rains. When I was born in 1996, the monsoon that year brought cholera. Not mild cholera, the kind where you recover and rejoin your life. The kind that emptied the village of 23 people in the space of 6 weeks. My mother carried me through those weeks. I was 3 months old, and she stopped nursing me because she was terrified the disease would pass through her milk. My father, the headmaster of our school, organized water distribution using wells that had been dug on higher ground, away from the runoff that collected in the main settlement. Even with precautions, people died. Old people, mostly, and 1 child. A boy who was 5 years old. His name was Vishal, and I only know this because my mother would mention it. Decades later, whenever the subject of the rains came up, Vishal, she would say. Do you remember Vishal? I didn't. I was an infant. But I came to know him through her memories, which made him vivid in a strange way, more real to me in death than many people who lived their entire lives around me. The rains of 1999 brought typhoid. The year 2002 brought a dengue fever outbreak, carried by mosquitoes that thrived in the standing water that collected everywhere once the monsoon began. In 2005, it was cholera again, a different strain but equally vicious. In 2008, dysentery. In 2010, leptospirosis. These weren't occasional, isolated incidents. These were patterns. These were laws of nature as reliable as gravity. Dr. Harris explained the science to anyone who would listen, and he listened very carefully himself, reading medical journals that came to him slowly through postal services and later through the careful downloading of PDFs on his ancient computer that took 40 minutes to load a single web page. The valley, he would explain, was a collection point for a particular set of environmental circumstances. The monsoon rains essential, as they were for agriculture, and for the aquifers that sustained us, also created conditions of incredible humidity, stagnant water in places where pools formed and couldn't drain properly, and the kind of warm, wet climate where waterborne pathogens thrived with fierce enthusiasm. The vector-borne diseases, the dengue, the malaria that also came sometimes, needed the mosquitoes, and the mosquitoes needed the water. The intestinal diseases needed contamination of the water supply, which happened repeatedly, despite the wells and the boiling and the precautions. Because in a village where water gets everywhere during monsoon, where it rises in the streets and seeps into places you didn't know water could reach, keeping it pure is like trying to hold sand in an open hand. Dr. Harris wasn't wrong. The science was sound. But science, I learned as I grew older, sometimes sounds like fate when you live inside it. I had a best friend named Priya. We were born in the same year, just 5 months apart, and we grew up tangled in each other's lives in the way that children do in small places. We attended the same school, my father's school, and we studied together and fought together and made elaborate plans for futures that would take us far away from Kalthi, to the cities, to universities, to lives that seemed impossibly glamorous and terrifying and essential. The monsoon of 2008, when we were 12 years old, was when Priya's younger brother contracted dysentery. His name was Rohan, and he was 7, and for 3 weeks he was the center of the universe. Not in the way that children sometimes are, drawing attention through their vitality and charm, but in the way that suffering draws everything around it like a gravitational field. The whole household, the whole street it seemed, revolved around his sickness. His mother barely slept. His father took leave from his job at the post office. Priya sat with him while he was ill, bringing him water, boiled, cooled, carefully measured, and reading to him from the books we'd checked out from the school library. I remember going to their house during this time, and Priya's mother would greet me at the door, but wouldn't let me inside. "Not yet," she'd say. "It's too contagious. You should go home." So I would stand in the doorway and talk to Priya through the gap, and she would tell me how Rohan's fever was up to 104 degrees, and the doctor said to wait it out, that the antibiotics would take time to work, and couldn't I understand that she couldn't leave him alone, even for an hour, to come sit under the banyan tree with me like we usually did? I understood. Or at least, I thought I understood. What I actually understood was that there was a limit to friendship, a point where it couldn't reach into the rooms where suffering happened. I was angry about that, I think, though I wouldn't have named it that way then. Rohan recovered. This is important. He did recover after those 3 weeks. The antibiotics worked, and the fever broke, and eventually he returned to school, still thin and pale, but alive and well, and himself again. Priya was radiant with relief. She held his hand when they walked through the village, and she was kinder to him for months, afterward bringing him snacks from home and defending him from other children in a way that made me both moved and a little jealous. But something had changed, I think, for Priya. The experience had taught her something about the fragility of things, about how quickly health could disappear, about how helpless you could be in the face of your own loved one's suffering. I was 14 when my father died. It wasn't during the monsoon. It was in the dry season, in March, when the sun felt personal in its intensity and the grass turned that particular shade of brown gold that I then never seen anywhere else. He had what he believed was influenza, a fever, a cough, a general malaise. Dr. Harris prescribed rest and fluids and an antibiotic, just in case it was something bacterial. My father, being a pragmatic man and the headmaster of a school of about 200 students, took the medicine and continued to work. 4 days later, pneumonia. 5 days after that, sepsis. 8 days after the initial fever, he was dead, gone in a way that seemed impossible while it was happening, and only slowly, over years, became the fixed fact of my life. The grief was enormous. It cracked me open. It is, at the moment I'm describing to you, still the largest thing that's ever happened to me. But here is what I want to tell you about how this relates to Kalthi and the rains. The village's response to my father's death was complicated, because he didn't die of the rain sickness. He died during the dry season of something that could have happened anywhere, in any climate, in any village. Pneumonia doesn't require a monsoon. It doesn't require the particular set of conditions that made Kalthi notorious for its seasonal epidemics. And so his death while mourned, didn't fit into the narrative that had formed in our village. It didn't confirm the thing we all believed, that the rains brought disease, that monsoon was the season of death, that there was something about this valley that made it dangerous and sick during those months. My father's death was an anomaly. And anomalies in a village that has become shaped by a particular story are almost more distressing than the catastrophes that fit neatly into the expected pattern. My mother withdrew after his death. She stopped attending the monthly meetings of the Women's Association. She stopped organizing food donations for families that had fallen on hardship. She stopped talking very much at all, except to me. And even with me, it was sporadic whole weeks of quiet, punctuated by small observations about the weather or what she'd bought at the market. I attended school still. I was a good student, particularly in science. I read everything I could find about disease vectors, about epidemiology, about the mechanisms by which infections spread through populations. I was trying, I think, to understand why the world was the way it was. Why my father had to die. Why Kalthi had to be sick. It was during this time, in my research, that I started to wonder something that no one in the village seemed to be asking. What if the narrative was wrong? The first challenge to the narrative came from an unexpected source, a filmmaker named Arun Mehta. Arun was the son of a family that had lived in Kalthi for one generation. His parents had moved there in the mid-1980s. His father was an engineer working on a hydroelectric project. Arun himself had left for Mumbai at 18 and become a documentary filmmaker, and he had done quite well for himself enough that he had returned to Kalthi in 2007 with cameras and microphones and the question that would eventually shape the next decade of our village's life. Why does a particular disease happen in a particular place? His plan, initially, was to make a straightforward epidemiological documentary. He would film the village, film the clinic, film Dr. Harish explaining the science of the disease vectors and the water contamination and the environmental factors. He would interview families who had lost people to the rains. He would capture the sorrow and the resignation and the facts, and he would create something that would educate people about the importance of disease prevention and water management in vulnerable areas. What he actually ended up doing was spending 3 years in Kalthi, living in his parents' house, gradually becoming aware that the narrative of disease was more complicated than the epidemiology alone could explain. He started noticing things. He noticed that in the weeks right before the monsoon, there would be a collective psychological shift in the village. Conversations became more anxious. People started checking their supplies of purified water more frequently. Women would begin rituals of prayer and propitiation in the temple, leaving offerings of flowers and coconut and incense. Dr. Harish's clinic would be packed with people seeking preventive medicines, requesting antibiotics in advance, asking for reassurance that their children would be safe. And then the rains would come, and sometimes disease would come with it, but not always. Sometimes the monsoon would arrive and pass, and nothing happened except that the crops were watered, and the aquifers were replenished, and life continued. The years varied. 2008, when Rohan got sick, had been a moderate year. A handful of cases of dysentery, a few cases of dengue, but no deaths. 2010 had been severe, but 2009 had been almost mild. 2011 had been terrible. 2012 had been light. There was variation, in other words. There was no absolute certainty. And yet the village spoke as though there was. The village had come to believe in the absolute certainty of disease, even though the actual epidemiological data showed variation and contingency and luck. Arun started interviewing people about this. Why did they fear the rains so much? What exactly did they believe would happen? Was it based on statistical likelihood? Or was it something else? The answers he got were interesting. Some people talked about the disease in very practical, scientific terms. They understood the mechanisms of transmission. They could explain vector biology. But others talked about it differently. They talked about the valley as a place, as an entity, as something that had a sickness built into it. One old woman, Mira Auntie, told him, "The valley breathes out its sickness when the air becomes heavy. We live inside it. We cannot escape it." Another man, Suresh, said, "My father told me his father told him that there was a great illness here, generations ago, that killed so many people that the land itself became marked by it. Some places carry that mark. Kalthi is one of them." Arun, to his credit, didn't dismiss these beliefs as superstition. He was a good filmmaker, which meant he was a good listener. He understood that beliefs were real, regardless of whether they had scientific justification, because they shaped behavior, and behavior shaped outcomes. So he filmed what happened when the monsoon came in 2010. The monsoon of 2010 was severe. There was flooding in the lower parts of the village. 3 families had to evacuate their homes. The rains came for 6 weeks almost without stopping, and the humidity was so thick that cloth grew mold if you didn't hang it in the sun. Water infiltrated places it shouldn't: the clinic, the school, several homes, and the disease came. Leptospirosis, a bacterial infection spread by contact with contaminated water and rodent urine. It started with a few cases in late June and had grown to 27 confirmed cases by mid-August. 3 people died. 2 of them were elderly, but one was a young woman, Divya, who was only 34 and left behind a 6-year-old daughter. Arun filmed it all. He filmed the clinic overflowing with patients. He filmed the funeral rites. He filmed Dr. Harish, exhausted and heartbroken, explaining that the conditions this year had been particularly conducive to the spread of the disease. He filmed families huddled in their homes, afraid to go out, afraid of the water, afraid of the air itself, it seemed. But he also filmed something else. He filmed that fear, as real as it was, seemed to increase the disease's spread. Here's what he documented. Families that were terrified avoided the clinic longer, hoping that the symptoms would go away on their own, that prayer or traditional remedies would work. By the time they sought treatment, the infection had progressed further, and the outcomes were worse. People didn't wash properly because they were afraid of water, and this paradoxically increased infection risk. Parents kept their children indoors, which meant poor ventilation and increased crowding conditions that made respiratory diseases more likely to spread among close contacts. The very fear of disease, in other words, was creating conditions that increased disease transmission. Arun interviewed Dr. Harish about this. He asked if the village could overcome its fear, if it could act rationally, despite being in the location where disease happens, would outcomes improve? Dr. Harish's response was measured. He said, "Yes, the psychological factors matter. Compliance with treatment matters. Proper implementation of preventive measures matters, but the disease would still come. The environmental conditions still exist. The bacteria would still be in the water. The monsoon would still bring the conditions for transmission." But Arun noticed something. Dr. Harish looked uncertain when he said this, as though he was reciting something he believed intellectually, but was less certain about viscerally. When Arun finally finished his documentary of film called The Valley's Breath, a title that drew from Mira Auntie's characterization of the land itself as a living thing that exhaled sickness, he premiered it in Kalthi first, before submitting it to film festivals. The premiere was held in the school auditorium. My school, the school my father had run, on a November evening in 2010. Most of the village came. It was the first time anyone had made art, in a serious way, about what Kalthi was going through. It was cathartic and painful, and strange to see ourselves reflected back on a screen. She said, "I agree. And I think that means that the solutions can't be purely medical. You can improve sanitation. You can train people in prevention. You can make sure treatment is available. And you should do all of those things. But you also have to address the psychology, the belief system, the narrative." I asked, "How do you change a narrative?" She said, That's what I'm trying to figure out. Dr. Kapoor published a paper based on her research. It was in a journal called Social Science and Medicine, and it was titled Disease, Narrative, and Community Identity, a study of monsoon-related health outcomes in a North Indian valley. She didn't mention Kalthi by name to protect privacy, but the details were unmistakably from our village. She described the pattern of disease outbreaks. She described the community's beliefs about the valley itself being sickly. She described the documentary that had brought these beliefs into critical examination. But the core of her argument was this: the village's psychological relationship to disease was as important as the epidemiology in determining health outcomes. Communities that feared disease and responded with avoidance behaviors had worse health outcomes. But communities that acknowledged risk while maintaining agency, that understood disease could occur but believed they had the power to respond effectively, had better outcomes. Moreover, she had analyzed the disease data over the 20 years that records had been kept. The year-to-year variation was significant. What had been framed as a predictable pattern disease, comes with the monsoon, was actually quite variable. Some monsoons brought severe outbreaks. Others brought mild ones. A few brought almost nothing at all. The difference, she hypothesized, was partially environmental: how much rain fell, how well the sanitation systems held up, how prepared the clinic was. But it was also partially behavioral and psychological. In years when fear was high and people avoided the clinic or delayed seeking treatment, outcomes were worse. In years when people maintained preventive practices but didn't catastrophize, outcomes were better. The paper was careful. Dr. Kapoor was a rigorous scientist. She noted the limitations of her study. She didn't claim to have definitive proof, but she made an argument that seemed, to me, radical and obvious at the same time. The narrative mattered. When a version of the paper was shared with the village, Dr. Harish saw it through an academic database. It sparked conversations. Some people felt validated. Others felt blamed. Some people got angry that their genuine suffering was being analyzed as a psychological phenomenon. But the most interesting response came from Meera Auntie. She said, in a conversation I overheard at the market, the doctor is saying that the sickness is real, but so is our fear. Both things can be true. We don't have to choose. But we do have to choose how we respond to the fear. That part is ours to choose. I finished medical school. I did an internship. I started thinking about what kind of medicine I wanted to practice, what role I wanted to play in the world of healthcare. And I decided to come back to Kalthi. This wasn't a dramatic decision. It wasn't made in a moment of revelation. It was more like a slow accumulation of realizations. That I was interested in community health, in the intersection of medicine and social factors. That I wanted to work somewhere I understood. That I was tired of running away. I was 26 years old when I moved back to the village where I had grown up. Dr. Harish was 63 by then. He had been running the clinic in Kalthi for 26 years. He had treated thousands of patients. He had watched disease patterns, seen people recover, seen people die. He was a good man, and he was tired. He welcomed me back with a warmth that surprised me. He offered me a job almost immediately. There was work to do, he said. There was always work to do. But I think what he really meant was, there's someone who understands this place now. There is someone who might be able to carry this forward in a different way than I have been able to. I accepted. The monsoon of 2014 was moderate. There were some cases of dengue, a handful of mild gastroenteritis cases, but nothing severe. We implemented the prevention programs that Dr. Harish had been running for years: water distribution, public education about hygiene, monitoring for early signs of outbreak. But I also started something new. I started meeting regularly with community leaders, the headmaster of the school, not my father, someone else, the temple priest, the female health workers, the women's associations. And I asked them a question that I don't think anyone had really asked before. What would need to change for you to feel safe? The responses were varied. Some people wanted better sanitation infrastructure. Some wanted more doctors available during monsoon season. Some wanted better communication about what symptoms to watch for. Some wanted traditional healing practices to be more integrated with modern medicine. Some wanted the rituals and prayers to be validated as part of the public health response, rather than treated as superstition or irrelevant. We started implementing changes based on these conversations. We brought in engineers to improve the water drainage systems. We trained community health workers to do early detection of disease symptoms. We held joint meetings where both Dr. Harish and the temple priest spoke about disease prevention from the medical perspective and from the spiritual perspective. We created a system where the precautions people wanted to take were channeled into effective prevention strategies rather than fear-based avoidance. And we talked. We told stories. I brought Arun back to help us create educational materials that focused not on fear but on agency. That said, here's what disease looks like. Here's what to do about it. Here's why prevention works. Here's what we've accomplished together. The monsoon of 2015 was heavy. The rains lasted for 2 months and brought significant flooding. But we were ready. The sanitation systems held up better. The early warning system caught problems fast. Yes, there were cases of dengue, a few of gastroenteritis, but we identified and treated them quickly. There were no deaths. For the first time in anyone's memory, the monsoon came without bringing catastrophe. People cried with relief. Not everyone. Not the people who believed that the valley's curse would always manifest, but enough people to matter. I remember standing in the clinic with Dr. Harish in early September, as the rains were tapering off, and he said to me, "Do you realize we might have actually done this? We might have actually changed something." I said, "It might have just been luck." "A good year." He said, "Yes, it might have been. But luck is a lot more likely to visit a place that's prepared, that's not paralyzed by fear." I think we made our own luck. I watched Priya watch it. She was there with her mother, and Rohan, who was now 12, and who had been sick 4 years earlier, but seemed to have forgotten the severity of it. To him, it was a story, rather than a lived experience. Priya's eyes were fixed on the images of the clinic, of Dr. Harish, of the faces of people she knew being interviewed. I wondered what she was thinking, whether she was remembering Rohan's fever, or whether she was thinking about something else altogether. The documentary didn't change everything overnight. This isn't that kind of story, where one person's artistic intervention transforms a place fundamentally. But it did something more subtle. It opened up a space where the narrative could be questioned. After the screening, there was a discussion. Dr. Harish attended, and he spoke about the environmental factors. But he also, for the first time in my hearing, said something like, "I wonder if our expectations about the monsoon have become self-fulfilling. Not that the disease isn't real, but that we have made it realer through our fear." And people started talking. They talked about what they had seen in the film. Some people got defensive. They didn't want to be told that their fear was irrational, that they themselves were complicit in the spread of disease. But others seemed thoughtful. They seemed to be reconsidering. Meera Auntie, who had been interviewed in the film and whose words had been woven throughout it, stood up and said, "I still believe the valley carries a sickness. But I don't know if that means we have to keep feeding it with our fear." Maybe there's a difference between acknowledging that something is hard and assuming that it's impossible. That was a small shift, but small shifts can compound. I was 17 when I left for university. I went to Delhi to study medicine, following a path that had seemed clear to me since my father's death. I wanted to understand disease, to understand medicine, to become someone who could help. But I also wanted to leave Kalthi. This is something I'm telling you with some shame, but I think it's important to be honest about it. I didn't want to be the village that feared rain. I didn't want to be defined by disease. I wanted to be somewhere that wasn't marked, the way I had come to feel Kalthi was marked. In Delhi, I thrived. I was a good student. I made friends from all over India, people who had never heard of Kalthi, who didn't know about the seasonal disease patterns, or the documentary, or any of the things that felt central to my identity growing up. That freedom was intoxicating. But I also became aware, through my studies, of something that the village hadn't seemed to fully grasp. We weren't unique. Every place has its particular disease profile. Every region has environmental factors that make certain illnesses more likely. The monsoon regions of India are generally more prone to waterborne diseases. Malaria is endemic to many places. Dengue is spreading. We weren't cursed. We were experiencing the normal operation of epidemiology. This should have been comforting. In some ways, it was. But in other ways, it felt like a different kind of loss, the loss of the story that made us special, even in our suffering. I came home for holidays, and Kalthi seemed both the same and completely different. The monsoon still came. Disease still came sometimes, though the past few years had been lighter. Only a handful of dengue cases in 2011. No significant outbreak at all in 2012. Dr. Harish was still there, still running the clinic, now with 2 other doctors assisting him. Arun's documentary had been screened at several film festivals and had become something of a small hit on the international documentary circuit. He had moved back to Kalthi permanently and was working on a second project. But the psychological landscape had shifted. The fear was still there. I could feel it in how people talked about June and July, in how they began their precautions, in how the clinic saw preventive visits spike before the monsoon. But it seemed less absolute, less like fate and more like a challenge to be managed. During my 3rd year of medical school, I met someone who had changed the trajectory of my thinking. Her name was Dr. Sanjana Kapoor, and she was a visiting professor who specialized in what she called medical anthropology, the intersection of medicine and culture, the ways that beliefs and social structures and stories shaped health outcomes. She was conducting research on communities that had experienced repeated disease outbreaks and how that affected community psychology and public health practices. Somehow, through the networking of academic connections, she learned about Kalthi, and she reached out to me. She said, "I understand you re from a village that has been dealing with recurring monsoon-related disease for decades. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to help me understand your community's perspective. I'd like to do research there, and I think having a local person involved would be important." I was hesitant. I had worked so hard to distinguish myself from being just the girl from the village that fears rain. But I was also intellectually curious. And I realize now, hungry to understand my own home through a different lens. So I agreed. And I brought Dr. Kapoor to Kalthi for the first time during the monsoon of 2013. Dr. Kapoor spent 3 months in the village. She was a small woman with gray streaking through her dark hair and an intensity in her eyes that reminded me of my father, a person who was genuinely trying to understand how the world worked rather than simply accepting the first explanation offered. She didn't come with a predetermined hypothesis. Instead, she came with questions. She asked people to tell her their stories of disease. She asked people what they did to prevent sickness. She asked what they believed and why they believed it and how certain they were of their beliefs. She observed the clinic, watching how patients presented, how Dr. Harish and the other doctors responded, how treatment decisions were made. She observed the rituals people performed, the prayers at the temple, the offerings, the preventive practices. She observed conversations between neighbors, between family members. And she talked to me. A lot. She wanted to understand what it felt like to grow up in a place defined by disease, how it shaped childhood, how it shaped aspiration, how it shaped your relationship to your own body and to risk. I told her about my father's death. I told her about watching Rohan recover from dysentery, while Priya maintained vigil over him. I told her about the feeling of fear that permeated the village before every monsoon, the way it seemed to settle into the very air. She listened, and she took notes, and she didn't try to fix anything or explain anything away. Toward the end of her time in the village, she asked me, "Do you think that Kalthi's experience of disease is primarily a medical problem, or primarily a psychological problem?" I said, "Both. They're entangled." The monsoon of 2016 was light. Barely any disease at all. Just a handful of dengue cases. As though the illness was some background presence that would always be there, but didn't have to be devastating. People started to relax. Not completely. The fear didn't disappear overnight, but they relaxed. Priya, who had stayed in the village and was now working as a teacher at the school, my father's school, still called the same thing, told me, "I'm starting to think about the future differently. I always thought I'd leave, but now I'm wondering if I actually want to stay." I asked her why. She said, "Because I think things are changing, and I think I want to be part of that change." She was right. Things were changing. Not everything. The valley didn't transform into something completely different. It was still a small village in the mountains with limited infrastructure and limited economic opportunity. But the psychological landscape was shifting. The story was being rewritten. In 2017, my mother got sick. She developed a fever during the dry season, in April, not during the monsoon. It turned into pneumonia, the same infection that had killed my father 15 years earlier. I treated her myself, working with Dr. Harish. We started antibiotics immediately. We monitored her carefully. We used all the tools that medicine had advanced in the 15 years since my father's death, and she recovered. After 2 weeks of fever and concern, her fever broke, her oxygen levels normalized, her breathing eased. She came out the other side alive. We never discussed whether her recovery was better because I was trained now, or because medicine had improved, or because she was lucky, or because we had caught it early. We didn't need to. She was alive, and that was enough. But it meant something to me, I think. It meant that the pattern could be broken, that the story I had inherited, the story of death from pneumonia, of father's disappearing, wasn't the only possible narrative. Dr. Harish retired in 2018. He was 67 years old, and he had been running the clinic in Kalthi for 31 years. We held a celebration for him. Half the village came. People told stories about him, about how he had treated their children, how he had delivered their babies, how he had sat with their dying and honored their passing. He cried during parts of it, though he was a composed man and tried not to show it. Before he left, he called me into his office, the same office where he had worked all those years with its faded certificates. On the wall and its jars of sample medicines, and its windows that looked out on the main street of the village. He said, "I've been thinking about what I've accomplished here. I treated thousands of patients. I saved lives. I lost lives. I did good work, I think. But I also wonder if I let the narrative of the place limit what I believed was possible." I spoke about the disease as something inevitable, something that the valley would always produce. I wonder if I contributed to the fatalism. I said, "You also did everything you could to prevent it. You educated people. You trained health workers. You made medicine available." He said, "Yes, but I think you've understood something I didn't, not fully. That medicine isn't just the pharmacology and the diagnosis. It's also the story we tell about what's possible. I was very good at the medicine, but I wasn't very good at the story." He paused, and then he said, "I think you'll be better at both." We hired another doctor, a younger woman named Dr. Priya, not my childhood friend Priya, but coincidentally the same name, who was interested in emergency medicine and community health. Together, we started to implement more comprehensive changes. We improved the water systems further. We started a community health education program that taught people about disease prevention but also about their own capacity to manage health. The monsoons came and went. Some years were heavier with disease than others, but nothing like the devastating outbreaks of the past. In 2019, we went through an entire monsoon season with only 5 dengue cases, all mild, all managed effectively. The fear was still there. You can't remove fear that has been embedded in a place for so long. The COVID-19 pandemic arrived in India in March of 2020, and Kalthi, like everywhere else in the world, suddenly found itself facing an entirely new disease crisis. But something unexpected happened. Because we had spent the previous 6 years rebuilding our relationship with disease, transforming it from something absolute, and faded into something that could be managed, we were, in some strange way, better prepared psychologically than many places. No one knew who might get severely ill or why, but we had learned something collectively about how to respond to disease without being paralyzed by it. We had learned about the importance of early action, of communication, of community cooperation. When the first suspected case appeared in Kalthi, a woman who had returned from the city and was showing respiratory symptoms, the village's response was measured and effective. We isolated her. We got her tested, driving her to the nearest city hospital, which had begun processing COVID tests. We informed all her close contacts. We asked everyone to quarantine. I remember standing in the clinic, looking at the setup we had prepared, the isolation ward we had established just for this possibility, the PPE we had stockpiled, the protocols we had written, and thinking, we know how to do this. We've practiced this, in a way. Not the specific virus, but the process of responding collectively to disease threat. The woman tested positive, but she recovered. She was mild enough that she didn't need hospitalization. After 2 weeks, she recovered, and life slowly returned to a cautious normal. Over the next year, Kalthi had 17 confirmed COVID cases. Not a single death. This was, we understood, partially luck. We didn't have elderly people in close quarters. We weren't a particularly dense population. Our case happened to be relatively mild. The village didn't avoid COVID entirely, but it managed it far better than many comparable communities. In 2021, Priya and I sat together under the banyan tree where we had sat countless times as children, and she said something that stayed with me. "Do you remember," she asked, "when we were kids, and we thought that getting out of this place was the most important thing in the world? That Kalthi was something we needed to escape. I felt that way for a long time," she said. "I didn't leave. I stayed because my family was here, and I was never brave enough to go alone. But I spent years resenting that. I felt like I had missed something, like I had settled for less. And now I think I was wrong. I think I got something from staying. I got to see a place transform. I got to be part of that. That's not settling. That's something meaningful. The fear is still here. It means you stop being paralyzed by how hard they are." She was right. The village wasn't ruled by the memory of disease anymore, but the memory was still there. It had become a part of the story, rather than the entirety of the story. In 2022, Arun completed his second documentary. The film was called The Valley Breathes Easier, and it premiered at a major film festival in India to significant acclaim. It was nuanced and honest. It didn't pretend that the problem had been solved. It showed the continued fragility of the health systems, the continued economic challenges, the continued reality of disease as a feature of life in this place. But it also showed the changes. It showed the community centers that had been built. It showed the water infrastructure improvements. It showed the health education programs. It showed people talking about their fear with more honesty, not denying it, but also not being controlled by it. Most importantly, it showed the idea that had driven my work in the village, that the story a community tells about itself is powerful. That narrative isn't just cultural window dressing. It's foundational to how people understand what's possible. When the film premiered in Kalthi, we held the screening in the school auditorium again, now refurbished and upgraded. The response was different than it had been for Arun's first film. People seemed less defensive, more reflective, more aware that they had been active participants in the transformation, rather than passive victims of circumstance. Mira Auntie, now very old and moving more slowly than she had in 2010, stood up during the discussion afterward and said, "I was right about the valley breathing, but I was wrong about what the breath meant. I thought it meant it was sick and couldn't help but make us sick. But I think it actually means the valley is alive, like any living thing. And living things can be sick or well, depending on what we feed them. We've been feeding this valley with our care instead of our fear, and it's responding." My personal life during these years was quiet and full, in the way that lives in small places can be. I wasn't married. I had focused on my work rather than on romantic relationships. Something I do and particularly regret, though it sometimes made me feel solitary in a village where most people my age had partners and children. But I had my work. I had Priya, my friend from childhood, who had become a consistent presence in my life again after years of partial distance. I had Dr. Priya, my colleague at the clinic. I had the community. I had the satisfaction of seeing health outcomes improve, of training younger health workers, of contributing to the slow, incremental transformation of how my village related to disease and to risk. I also, during the early 2020s, started doing research of my own. I began collaborating with Dr. Sanjana Kapoor, the medical anthropologist I had met during medical school, on a longer-term study of how communities heal from collective trauma related to endemic disease. The research took the form of interviews and community conversations. We were interested in how Kalthi had managed to shift from a narrative of doom and inevitability to a narrative of challenge and agency. What had been the key moments? How had people's beliefs changed? What role had individuals played versus collective action versus external circumstances? The answers, we found, were complicated and multifaceted. There wasn't one cause. It wasn't just Arun's documentary, though that had been important. It wasn't just improved infrastructure, though that had mattered. It wasn't just the arrival of new leadership, though my return to the village and my particular approach to medicine had probably contributed. It was all of these things, intersecting and reinforcing each other, creating conditions where a shift could occur. But there was one factor that came up again and again in our interviews, and I think it's worth highlighting here. It was the willingness of ordinary people in the village, to question the narrative they had inherited. Mira Auntie had done this. Suresh had started to do it. Priya had done it. Dr. Harish, in his later years, had done it. Regular people, no particular authority or expertise, had begun to ask, is what we believe about this place actually true? And is it serving us? These questions, once asked, couldn't be unasked. They opened up space for alternatives. In 2023, I was invited to speak at a medical conference in Delhi about community-based approaches to public health and the role of narrative in shaping health outcomes. I presented the work we had done in Kalthi, the data showing the improvement in disease outcomes, the frameworks we had developed for community engagement. But more than the data, I tried to convey the feeling of living in a place that had transformed its relationship with disease. I tried to describe what it was like to watch a community move from resignation to agency, from fear to vigilance, from a story of doom to a story of challenge and resilience. After my presentation, a woman approached me, a public health official from another part of India where there were endemic disease problems. She asked, "How do you help a community see that their narrative is changeable? How do you get people to question what they believe?" I thought about this carefully before answering. I said, "I don't think you can force it. I think what you can do is create the conditions where questioning becomes possible. You bring in people from outside, documentarians, researchers, people who can offer a different perspective. You improve the material conditions, the infrastructure, and the resources so that people aren't completely overwhelmed. You listen to what people actually want and need rather than imposing solutions. And then you wait. You give people time and space to think about their situation differently. She said, "That sounds very slow." I said, "It is. But I don't think there's a faster way to actually change how people relate to something. You can change behavior in the short term through coercion or incentive. But changing belief, changing narrative, that's slower work. But it also lasts longer. The monsoon of 2023 was my favorite one in the time I had been running the clinic. Not because it didn't bring any disease. It did. Some dengue cases, a couple of mild cholera cases that we caught early. But because the village's response was so different. People came to the clinic early when they noticed symptoms. They weren't hiding their illness out of fear. They weren't avoiding water out of panic. They were being vigilant, yes, but not catastrophizing. And the monsoon itself felt different. The rains came and watered the crops and filled the aquifers, and the valley seemed to express what it had always been expressing: life, growth, the conditions necessary for things to flourish. Alongside that, yes, there were conditions that disease could exploit, but that seemed like a normal part of what it meant to be alive, rather than a unique curse. I remember standing at the edge of the village one afternoon during a particularly heavy downpour, watching the rain fall, watching the water run through the streets and channels we had built, watching the people move about with purpose rather than fear. And I thought, this is what transformation looks like. Not the absence of disease or rain or difficulty, but a different relationship to it. My mother, who had recovered from pneumonia in 2017, passed away peacefully in her sleep in 2024. She was 78 years old. It wasn't a disease that took her. It was just the accumulation of years, the way that bodies eventually cease to function. I grieved her, but the grief was different than the devastating rupture of my father's death. It was sadness and also gratitude for the years I had her back, for the way she had watched the village transform, for the conversations we had as I learned to work in medicine. At her funeral, many people from the village came. They spoke about her kindness, her quiet strength, the way she had raised me after my father died. And someone, I think it was Mira Auntie, said, her son gave us Dr. Harris, and her daughter gave us herself. The valley has been blessed by this family. I cried when she said that. But they were the kind of tears that acknowledge how much the world can change, how much we can matter to the places where we live. Now I am 30 years old. I have been back in Kalthi for 4 years. I run the clinic with Dr. Priya. We have trained 8 community health workers who do early detection and health education throughout the village. We have improved the water infrastructure substantially. We have established a joint clinic day once a month where we work with the traditional practitioners who have always been part of our community, offering what we call integrative care. The disease patterns in Kalthi have changed. There are still outbreaks sometimes. The monsoon still brings conditions that favor certain illnesses. But the catastrophic epidemics of the past 3 decades have not returned. We've had years where dengue cases are in the single digits. We've had monsoons where we see no cholera at all. More importantly, the psychological relationship to disease has transformed. When I talk to children in the school, now they understand illness as something that happens sometimes that you respond to with care and treatment, not something that defines your entire relationship to the seasons and to the place where you live. I recently asked a 10-year-old girl, "Are you afraid of the monsoon?" She said, "Monsoon is good. It helps the crops grow. Sometimes you get sick during monsoon, but the doctor helps you get better." My grandmother says it used to be much worse, but she also says that we learned how to take care of each other better. This child doesn't carry the weight of fear that I carried, that Priya carried, that an entire generation carried. And I think that's the most important measure of what we've accomplished. Priya and I still sit under the banyan tree sometimes, though our conversations are different now. She is working on developing a curriculum for the school that teaches children about health and disease in more nuanced ways. I am working on a proposal for extending the model we've developed in Kalthi to other villages in the region. Sometimes we talk about the past, about our childhood, about the fear we felt, about the people we lost. But we also talk about the future, and there's something different in how we talk about it. It feels like something we have agency in, rather than something that's happening to us. She told me recently, I think the thing I'm most grateful for is that I got to watch a place change its mind about itself. Not everyone gets to see that. Most people live their whole lives in narratives that never shift. But we got to be part of something transforming. I agreed. And I added, and I think the transformation isn't finished. I think it's going to keep going. I think maybe the real work is just beginning. Dr. Harris still lives in Kalthi, though he's retired now. He comes to the clinic sometimes to visit, and he's become a mentor to me in a more formal sense. We meet monthly to discuss cases and approach, and he reads all the research papers I'm working on with Dr. Kapoor. Recently, he said to me, I spent 31 years trying to solve the problem of disease in this village using only medical tools. You're solving it using medicine and narrative and community participation and environmental change. I think you're going to accomplish more than I did, not because you're a better doctor than I was, but because you understand that medicine is only part of the answer. I said, I'm just standing on what you built. He said, yes, but you're building something different on top of it. That's what matters. There's a question that I think about sometimes, and I think I should address it directly before I finish this narrative. The question is, did we actually solve anything? Or did we just get lucky? Did we change Kalthi's disease patterns through our interventions? Or did the patterns naturally shift for other reasons? The honest answer is, I don't know for certain. Disease is complex. Epidemiology involves countless variables. Maybe the disease patterns would have improved anyway. Maybe we were just fortunate. Maybe the environmental conditions changed for reasons we don't fully understand. Maybe immunity in the population increased. Maybe the pathogens themselves changed. From a strict scientific perspective, it's hard to claim definitive credit for the improvement. There were no randomized controlled trials. We can't run Kalthi through time twice, once with our interventions and once without, to see which produced better outcomes. But here's what I do know. The village engaged in collective action. The sanitation systems improved. The health awareness increased. The clinic became more accessible and more trusted. The psychological relationship to disease shifted in measurable ways. And the health outcomes improved. Whether you attribute that improvement primarily to the material changes, or to the psychological shifts, or to luck, or to some combination, it doesn't actually matter very much for the purposes of this story. What matters is that something changed. A place that had been defined by disease and fear became a place that integrated disease and risk into its life in a more sustainable way. I want to return to the beginning for a moment, to the thing I said about my mother teaching me how to pray for the opposite of what you want. What I meant was this. When the monsoon was coming, my mother would take me to the temple, and we would make offerings, flowers, coconut, incense, and she would whisper prayers. But the prayers weren't what I expected. She didn't pray for the monsoon not to come. She didn't pray for disease not to strike. She prayed for the strength to face what came. She prayed for healing if people got sick. She prayed for the wisdom to know what to do. This confused me as a child. I asked her, "Why don't you pray for the disease not to come?" And she said, "Because the monsoon will come regardless of my prayers. The disease might or might not come, but what I can control is how I respond. So I pray for that." It took me decades to understand what she was teaching me, but I think she was teaching me the central wisdom that my work in Kalthi is based on. You cannot always control what happens to you. But you can control how you relate to it. You can control whether you respond with agency or with resignation. You can control whether you participate in creating the conditions for transformation. The valley that feared rain taught me that. Through its suffering, through its disease, through the decades of loss and sorrow, it taught me that fear itself is a choice in the end. And so is courage. And so is the decision to try. When I finish my work in the clinic most days, I walk through the village. I pass the school where my father taught. I pass the temple where my mother taught me to pray. I pass the banyan tree where Priya and I have sat countless times. I pass the homes of families I've treated, children I've vaccinated, elderly people I've cared for in their final years. And I notice things. I notice that the children seem to smile more, though perhaps that's my imagination. I notice that during the monsoon, people still take precautions, but they do it with a kind of confidence rather than desperation. I notice that the clinic is busy, but it's a productive kind of busy, not a crisis management kind of busy. I notice that the narrative has changed. The village is no longer the place that fears rain in my mind. It's still the place where I grew up, the place where my father died, the place that taught me about disease and fear and the fragility of life. But it's also the place where I learned that narratives can be questioned, that communities can transform, that medicine is as much about psychology and social conditions as it is about pharmacology. It's the place where I learned that sometimes the most important work you can do is help a place tell itself a different story about what it is. The monsoon is coming again this year. It will arrive in June, as it always does. There will be rain, heavy and relentless. There will be humidity and standing water and the conditions that pathogens love. And there will probably be disease, maybe dengue, maybe cholera, maybe something we haven't encountered before. We're preparing. We're checking our supplies. We're reviewing our protocols. We're making sure the sanitation systems are ready. We're preparing our community for what might come. But we're not afraid. Or rather, we're appropriately cautious, but not controlled by fear. We understand that disease is possible, that risk exists, that suffering might occur. But we also understand that we have agency, that we can respond, that we can care for each other. And that understanding, I think, is the most important thing any community can have. This is the story of the village that feared rain and how it learned to stop fearing and start responding. It's the story of how narrative and medicine and community action can intersect to create transformation. It's the story of my home and of how I learned to love it not by leaving it, but by returning to it and helping it heal. The rains will come, and we'll be ready. Asterisk, thank you for listening to this story. I'm grateful you spent this time with me, traveling to a place you may never visit in person, but I hope can understand in spirit. If you've been moved by what you heard, if you found something in this narrative that resonates with your own experiences of disease, of community, of fear and transformation, I'd love to hear about it. Leave a comment and tell me where you are in the world. Tell me what time it is for you. Tell me what this story brought up for you. Asterisk, asterisk, because stories are how we know we're not alone in what we experience. Stories are how we learn that others have faced similar darkness and found ways through it. Stories are how we transform our own narratives. Asterisk, asterisk, I'll be back tomorrow with another story. Until then, be gentle with yourself and with the communities you're part of. They need your care more than you know.